beautiful people. I am Oliver Perrin for Semiagog, joined today, and pleased that it is so, by Ruminations, who has a channel on YouTube. He reached out to me suggesting possibilities for discussion, and we settled on one between the two of us, and that will be the new right and the future of individualism, if not individuals and individuality. We'll have to chisel out the details of this discussion going forward. We'll begin that in just a moment. Before we get started, please do follow both my channels, Semiagog and A Safer Space, both here on YouTube and over on BitChute. Most of you have seen that YouTube is beginning to swing the hammer with zeal, thereby smashing up channels left and right. So it's probably prudent to follow my content over on BitChute as well. Otherwise, there's Gab, there's Minds, there's a Discord server, there's Twitter, and for those who wish to support the channel, there is GoFundMe and Subscribestar. Thanks as always to those who do help out with support, all of the credit and none of the blame. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I have Ruminations before me. We're going to be talking about this idea of individualism and its future with potential growth on the right. Before we get started, I would like to give him an opportunity to tell you a little bit about his channel. So I hand it off to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Oliver. My channel began as an endeavor in trying to find a way of building unity on the right. And so I began with these videos on political theory, taxonomizing the various elements of the new right. But very quickly, I also started to branch off into theories on Jungian typology, often known as Myers-Briggs. I have a playlist going into all of the major philosophers throughout Western history. And I do book reviews of both fiction and nonfiction. The ethos of the channel is to bring all of these topics together into some kind of unified whole and to explore the meaningful interconnectedness between these topics.
And I've seen you've done a number of discussions with people as well. Some seem to be friendly discussions, others verge upon debates.
Yes, they certainly verge upon debates, but there's no reason that debates can't be cordial as well. I think that those are of value in themselves because, after all, you might say departure in opinion is the whole reason for freedom of speech. And in a certain sense, it's the essence of individualism, which is what we are discussing this evening. What I would say is that different people have different concepts of what the limits of cordial debate are. I think that some people think that in order to be principled, they have to admit some degree of volatility. I don't agree with that at all. I think that in order to treat important topics with the proper degree of respect, that there has to be a certain degree of level-headedness that prevails so that people don't turn it into a social affair.
Yes, and when considering the realm of ideas, or ideals even, if you will, there's some argument to be made that it is timeless. And so feeling rushed or, urgent or angry and these sorts of things would appear to be contraindicated. So yeah, I welcome your attitude and I will do my best to respond in kind. So we have this idea of growth, ferment, certainly on the right. And there's a lot changing, if you want to take the model of a collective unconscious, a roiling collective unconscious and new things bobbing up out of it. And with all of that going on the right, the political aspects, the social implications, cultural stuff, and the rest, one consistent theme seems to be a certain skepticism towards individuality. One of the most common things you hear is that it's all about atomization, or that the Jews wish to destroy the West by forcing people further and further off down these winding byways of insignificance and nihilistic self-destruction, and it's all centered on this idea that individualism fractures collectives and groups as a whole, and makes it so that they cannot function as effectively against those that operate as collectives or with collective interests in mind. Now, that's certainly not the case everywhere. There's much more nuanced consideration going on, even over on the furthest fringes of the right. Many recognize that there is something about Western culture and Western peoples that seems to be designed, if you will, in this context, to foster the emergence, the appearance of individuals, and exceptional individuals at that. You have the idea of heroes in the West, and they don't always fall into that sort of pathetic category of those who sacrifice themselves for others. It's not always the case. We have many old stories about hubris and flying too close to the sun and being cast off of Pegasus, or Hercules finding a place for himself in the night sky. So there are all sorts of traditions, and that's just sort of scratching the surface, talking about one facet of it. There are many others, recognition of the individual in English common law, many different angles of attack for this. So you can probably say that there are some that are for that individualism. There are others that sort of reflexively have a knee-jerk reaction and reject it as something that has been foisted on Western culture from outside. And then with that, we also have over on the left, if you will, a certain lack of interest in individuality, with what are referred to as individual persons really amounting within their various ideologies to be little more than collections or intersections of grievance categories. So, the question is, what will happen with our cultural attitudes towards individualism and, institutions? One of them I mentioned is, legal institutions and the rest. What will happen as changes continue to roil the right, and it continues to be, appears to be continuing to grow, and with the left not so interested in it as well. That's one side of this. And I guess what we should probably do to get started, I'll turn it over to you, but perhaps we should work out some sort of quick thumbnail sketch of what we mean when we talk about individualism. Probably not going to require too much work, but just to establish your definition. And then perhaps our views of what's going on with the right versus the left, what these things mean.
Well, I think that there are kind of two aspects of individualism. There is political individualism, which the libertarians and classical liberals do a good job of defending, but that is a kind of arrangement that we have for society with respect to the state. But I think that on a deeper level, libertarians often glaze over an equally important aspect of individualism, which is that the meaning of life is a kind of self-actualization. It's a kind of immediate subjective apprehension of what is immediately and emotionally valuable to oneself as part of the pursuit of happiness. I think that if there's one thing that makes life worth living, it has to be that immediate apprehension of a kind of state of well-being. I see individualism as being a social arrangement whereby the circumstances are provided so as to facilitate that individual journey of self-actualization.
I'll take that. That aligns very much with my own attitudes about it. Agency, self-realization, many of these things that you just mentioned. Okay, so let's see if you can move us as quickly through left and right. I have my doubts, given that what a morass it is in many respects. Determining what it is and having it be anything other than superficial and arbitrary. But what would your first shot out of the box be for identifying these two categories?
Well, I will start with the qualification that by my definition, it's by no means certain that I am right wing in the universal sense of the word. I may be to an extent, but I would say that being on the right means that you embrace the anthropological, traditional man. That is, you believe in hierarchical communities with in group preferences, with strong gender roles, with a kind of ethnic identity, basically what you might call traditionalism. Whereas I would say that the left is anything that tends to want to level that down or to reorganize society after some alternative model. Now, to some extent, I would actually like to do that. In other senses, I would not. But I think that most people really lie somewhere in the middle of this spectrum from the far right, which would be something like the Hindu caste system, versus the far left, which would be something like a modern SJW college campus. Really, most sensible people are, you might say, more proximate to the cosmic center, but that kind of concept of hierarchical traditionalist modes of being, like, say, the Chinese or the Hindus or the Muslims or what have you, embrace, versus a sort of more egalitarian, future oriented, and original vision as to what reality looks like.
Hmm. And so, by saying that it would be more traditional, presumably that would apply to our own culture here in the West. And so the idea would be that, if I'm following you, would be that older, more traditional social structures that are carried forward by time, tested by time in many respects, reflect biological reality more accurately than some of these utopian egalitarian visions.
They may or may not reflect them. Well, they do reflect them more accurately. What I would say with respect to our Western traditions is that they are right wing only in a relative sense. They are right wing relative to the radical left progressivism, but they themselves have internalized a certain degree of individualism, progressivism, legal egalitarianism that is associated with the development of English history. So, to some extent, we're all leftists, or at least centrists of one kind of another. Even, say, a neo-Confederate who supports the Old South is still some kind of advocate of Republican government or of legal individualism or something of that nature. So the right wing per se is something that is very foreign to what I think even people who conceive of themselves on the right would find permissible today.
Right. When you take a look at, for example, the suffocating hierarchy that you might find in China, or when you consider that against the background of European history with all its convoluted developments, the Jacobin clubs where people would gather together to conspire, drink coffee, and all the rest. Republicanism, prior to the French Revolution, republicanism was the big product of these Jacobin plots. So the experiment in the United States, even with its maintenance of hierarchy in many respects and a certain degree of conservative traditionalism, certainly by comparison today, with today built in, this was, as you say, much more towards the left compared to many of these things that existed historically. So that's a very nicely put point about that relative aspect of the right. Now, I wonder if, and we will get to where, we are properly discussing individualism and its prospects with development on the right, the relative right, here in the U.S. and perhaps across the West as well. But I wonder if there's another angle. I wonder what comes to your mind when you think about the the right and left, together with the idea of wild versus domesticated. When you hear those two terms, what comes to mind? How does it map against this background we're discussing?
Well, I'm actually not familiar with the jargon of domesticated versus wild in the context of the current discussion, so I would need a little more information on that.
Well, it perhaps is a byway we don't need to go down, but as domesticated animals have any number of characteristics that come into being as they move from wild to domesticated. You'll find certain splotches and patches that appear on their coats, the kind of spotting that you see with dogs and some cats, that is not as common with wild animals. But when you get the herd animals together and domesticate them, they also get a more domed brain case. They tend to be less aggressive. All the kind of things that you associate with domestication, or the idea of being housebroken. Whereas with the wild, or another feature that I should mention with domesticated is that they become it becomes much easier to bring them together, to have them mate, and they become less particular about it. Wild, you can't keep them as pets. Their instinctive responses that they cannot hold in abeyance. Anyway, that's something I'm thinking about. I figured I'd just throw it out there since you were giving me some sharp responses. That's something I myself will consider further, mainly because there were some folks in, though it's unpopular to say it, in Germany in the middle of the 20th century, who were giving some thought to how civilization itself could be mapped onto the idea of domestication. And if you take a look at the things that happen to animals as they become domesticated, both individually, both biologically and taken as a whole within their social relations, that man's self-domestication could be called civilization. Civilization could be called his self-domestication. And if we see these characteristics arising among animals that have undergone the process of domestication, of what value is mapping all that out onto what happens to human beings as they become quote unquote more civilized? That's why I brought that up. But yeah, it's probably a bit out of our scope. Let me just see here. We've got the idea of authoritarian and hierarchy. We've got egalitarian with its flatness. The idea of the individual versus the collective is probably something we're going to have to dig into. Well then, where would you like to start with this notion of individualism and the right? Do you have any visions of it?
Well, I do. Two things that I would like to say. The first is that we need to realize that individualism is the exception. It is the anomaly. While both you and I are advocates of individualism, it is not the normative human mode of being. So what I think is happening is that the left has, you might say, constituted the backlash of nature against this kind of individualism that we've become accustomed to. And I think that the right is responding in kind. So what we're seeing is, I think, an aspect of nature reasserting itself. So basically you have women, for example, in the Me Too movement. That would be an example of women saying, we don't like being treated as individuals because, to be honest, women are more collectivist. You have other races, for example, organizing along identitarian lines. I see that as kind of nature reasserting itself and saying, we cannot tolerate the encumberments of being individuals. And the right is kind of taking the bait and is responding in kind with collectivism. So by no means are we on the side of nature. Rather, this is, you might say, the anthropological man reasserting himself. And I guess the goal at hand is to defend modernity and its individualist element against itself.
Or against its fruits, certainly.
Yes.
Yeah, that's interesting that you bring that up, because it kind of neatly tapped the whole basis of my willingness to engage in cooperation with a set of groups, I really should say, that does tend towards the identitarian itself. Because in underlining that the exception, what you're calling the anthropological man, let's just say man taken as an animal, and let's say the statistical frequency of, an individualistic outlook culturally versus one that is not. It's very much, it seems to me very much that the West is the sole culture that has how do I say this? The Western collective is determined on the basis of it, for me anyway, of it being that group that does, if only imperfectly and inconsistently, promote individualism. And so we're very different, speaking broadly for the West, to whatever extent I can. We're very different than the rest of the cultures in the world because we do promote individualism. And so that brings me around to why I myself am willing to endorse, or at least to cooperate with, to endorse many of the ideas of and to cooperate with movements that has a distinctly identitarian streak to it. And it really comes down to the fact that the West is defined in this way, as I do for myself, as a thing, as a culture that can be distinguished from the others primarily based upon having the individual as a target, as an aspirational ideal, as a thing that you seek culturally to produce, not to the exclusion of, cooperative elements in society and the rest. But if it's the only one, then there I've neatly got my map laid out for why it is it would make sense for me as an individualist to cooperate and to make common cause to whatever extent I do. And I think you brought up the basis of that quite well in saying that it's not common. But you had something else to say, I think, as well.
Well, what I would like to say, and I think that this builds nicely on that, is that we are faced by a curious dilemma right now, and that is that the only people who are willing to defend the preconditions for an individualistic society are the same people who reject individualism. But on the other hand, there are many people like libertarians who embrace individualism but are blind to the preconditions of individualism. So, for example, some preconditions. I think there are three obvious ones. There has to be some kind of background of Christianity. There has to be some background in Greco-Roman philosophy, and there has to be a largely white ethnic demographic. Those are by no means guarantees, but they are preconditions empirically for the soil that's necessary to grow an individualistic culture. But you have the alt-right, the traditionalists, who may be willing to defend those bases, but they reject the thing for which they serve as a basis. Then you have the libertarians who are who want the final product but are unwilling to defend the preconditions, and that's one of the reasons that I advocate unity between individualists and right-wing collectivists.
So it's almost as though with the harder-edged alt-right traditionalists, they're busy ripping up the weeds that grow in the black soil they say they love. And with the libertarians, they're consistently trying to plant seeds on concrete, one of these kinds of situations. Well, there's one thing I wanted to throw in. I'd like to jump over to your selection of these three elements, Christianity, the Greco-Roman background, and what was the third?
A largely white demographic.
Right. But before I do that, I forgot to mention this before, and I intended to, when you talked about individuality and not being sort of a natural course of things, at least insofar as nature is reasserting herself. And I wonder if that's true. I would not argue that it's not, but that is a place where I've very much placed a question mark. Whenever some sort of innovation occurs with humanity, and this is a thing that my friend Tim Russo has discussed on a number of occasions, which is what sort of put it in my mind. Whenever an innovation occurs, there's a certain amount of risk with it. So that could be a genetic sport, right, that might yield scales turning into feathers, right, which would lighten you up, and then you get some hollowing bones, and the next thing you know, you can fly around, and that's an evolutionary jump, right? That can open up whole new categories of biodiversity, but a risk comes with it, and if you want to think about that, you roll the genetic dice. What happens, when you give birth to a monster rather than some new type that can serve as a basis of a species. I recognize I'm horribly compressing the span of evolutionary time down into an instant like that, but for purposes of illustration. And it seems to me that this focus on individuals corresponds with the development of the human ego. How can I lay this all out? You've got the basic idea of evolution, and then with the appearance of culture, many have hypothesized that what culture amounts to is a new dimension of evolution, where changes can occur and can be made manifest through things like technology, while, for example, the physical organism remains more or less as it did previously, right? So you have a new front opening up for evolution. So intellectual pursuits, spoken language, the more complex aspects of culture that are unique to humans. The ego itself seems to be a part of any development of a sense of individuality, as you described it earlier. And yet a risk comes with it, like the atomization that the alt-right always likes to talk about. And so I can't decisively or definitively address what you're talking about, but I did want to place a question mark there, because it could be that sense of self and of agency that always walks the knife edge, it wants to slip off into atomization or mere egotism rather than individuation. That might be a threshold development at the level of cultural evolution as a sort of extended front of biological evolution. And so while there are risks, and while the inherently conservative nature of man the animal, like, I think I'm going to beat that over the head with a rock until it stops moving because it might be a threat to this established order. Take that metaphor where you will. It may be that the conservative aspect of mankind resists it and has reactions to it that snap it back. And certainly, as I said, there may be a great deal of risk to it. And so you've got that whole dynamic there. That is not, however, to say necessarily that nature itself could not be arcing towards this thing, which is a more perfect individuality. But I'll allow you to respond to that as you like. But I do, of course, want to hear about the business with Christianity, whites, and Greco-Rome.
Yes, well, I will have to say something about what you just said, because that's a big deal. What I would say is that I'm open to that possibility that there may be some new frontier for evolution, or for, you might say, simply moving on to the next stage, as it were, in a more permanent kind of way, much like we moved from being hunter-gatherers to being civilized agrarians, that the story may not be over. But what I would say is that in my experience, most people are conformists. I think that there are good reasons evolutionarily why this would be the case. I can see the psychological basis for it. And also, even if those are not the reasons, it's clearly something that's very deeply ingrained in the human experience from the experience of the past. The thrust of my argument is that we shouldn't be surprised or discouraged that it hasn't fully taken root yet, because it's going to take a lot more than simply the Enlightenment to move on to the next major stage of human development.
Yeah, it's just lipstick on a pig, looking at, this recent cultural innovation compared to all of human history. And to, apply probably a better metaphor, a sequence of steps is nothing but a series of controlled falls. So until the heel comes down on that leading step, it seems like you're simply falling forward into space, and perhaps that's what's happening now. We're waiting for the next step to land, the other shoe to drop, however you like, with this development of individualism. But I wanted to jump over, thank you for that, to this business of these three requirements that you see for individualism to appear. And the odd one is Christianity, perhaps. I can see it, I think, through the idea of the soul and all in the world having one, and it being universally present. I often think to myself, a lot of people like to talk about how the Jews are the big problem with the idea of a chosen people. And for my part, this is something I'm working on that I'll do a clip about later. I think it has just as much to do with Christianity. I think there's a weird conflation of the idea of chosen people becoming universal that happens with the interaction of Ashkenazi and some Sephardic Jewish culture with European culture, and the way in which these elements played off of each other coming up through the Enlightenment. But that universalism I see very much as a two-edged sword, and so I'm very interested to hear, in the sense that it can lead to collectivism and ecclesia, a body of Christ, right, all subsumed within the perfect man individuality, so to speak, of God manifest as man. So it can drag you as easily into the direction of a kind of collectivism, one would think, as it could in the direction of any kind of an individuality, that comes with the idea of recognizing everybody has a unique, valuable, immortal soul.
Well, what I would say is that I agree with you that the central element of this aspect of Christianity is the soul. The idea that there is a kind of individual, and it's ultimately the salvation of the individual which is important, which can be translated into temporal salvation, which you might say is your kind of fulfillment as an individual. There's also the element in Judeo-Christianity of the Ten Commandments, of the idea that the laws are not simply a kind of group code of conduct, but that they do carry some kind of universal deontic quality. I think that in terms of whether or not Christianity is more collectivist or individualist, I think it's important to contextualize it. You can't ask, is Christianity good for individualism compared to my ideal society? You have to ask, is it good for individualism in relation to other religions?
Right.
I can't think of any other major religion that has served as a basis for individualism, nor can I think of any other society in which the religion has served as the ground for individualism. Now, what I will say is that the alt-right is partially correct in its critique of Christianity, in the sense that Calvinist Christianity, with its emphasis on guilt, atonement, this kind of burden of perpetual guilt, which one is always carrying around with oneself, and which translates in Calvinism into sort of the politics of Puritanism, like the early American Republicans, like Abraham Lincoln, the abolitionist movement, prohibitionism, that kind of thing. That certainly is something that has fed into political correctness. There's no doubt that that particular breed of evangelical Christianity has fed the psychology of the left. And so it does make it so that today's collectivism is more sentimental, more moralistic, more insufferable than maybe you might say the refreshing honestness of Islam or Hinduism or the Japanese or whatever. But I think it's really a matter of taking stock of all the pros and cons and the trade-offs. And I can tell you, I would very much like to live in a society whose history has been predominantly Christian than any other religion.
Yes, and very quickly, because I want to get over to the idea that these elements need to be present in a culture, or that if they are present, it's more likely that you will produce individuals, because then we can get to the idea of Western culture as producing individuals, and we can then maybe plot, the jumps of developments in Western culture. We're dealing with the present to bring it back to the subject. But I do want to ask, just as a passing thing, because I know there's going to be some alt-right guy watching, with his hammer of Thor around his neck, or, thinking about burning an old rune church. What would you say to the idea of some enthusiastic neo-pagan today who would argue that the pagan period of time with its heroes and all the rest left scope for individualism and individuality? I mean, indeed, if you take the idea of heroes in Western culture and the idea of demigods, which it's not precisely the idea of individuality because they're always distinct from the others. You got the Greek idea of the few and the many, but surely the individualistic aspects of Christianity didn't spring up full blown from beneath the cabbage leaf. You know, there must have been elements that were winding through time, you know, like strands. And, you know, we have the cultural impact of the Jewish material coming through the heretical and revolutionary figure of Christ, and then being brought over into the West. Surely all that is individual in Western culture didn't have to wait until Christianity appeared. Maybe this is the perfect introduction for your point about Greco-Roman culture.
Well, it is. What I would say is that this hypothetical white nationalist has not taken into account that I've also made whiteness, including the Greco-Roman ethnic expression of whiteness, as also a precondition. So I take the point that this aspect of Greco-Roman philosophy and the Indo-European civilization going back to before the time of the Greeks is also necessary, but it's not enough, and here is why it's not enough. So, and this is a mistake that Nietzsche made in his early days of romanticizing the Greek city-states. Sure, maybe Odysseus in the Odyssey, for example, was an individual. Maybe a few other characters were, but look at all of the other people surrounding him. Look at his servants, look at his slaves, look at the women, look at the people he's fighting. It is not an individualistic story that's being told. There just happens to be a character who is an individual.
That's where you see the tendency of the aristocracy to seek to create exceptional people as part of their whole ethos. And yeah, that could be a subject suitable for consideration on its own. You know, how the disappearance of the idea of the aristos, you know, from the Greek for the best or the highest, you know, the exceptional, that class disappearing, much against the wishes of people like Alexander Hamilton. That class distinction between them and the proles, or, you know, or even stages where you've got, you know, the idea of the aristocrats and the yeomen, and then, you know, the idea of the serfs, or those who are taken in common, you know, who have no mark of their own like an aristocrat does upon their shield. And so not having any character of their own, they're deemed very often bad characters, and they take the character of another, often marked by the state, like a V on the thumb for vagabond or an M for malefactor. You know, they're those who have no mark, who also tend to not have any knowledge of the generations of their family, who also therefore have no sense of breeding towards a thing or away from a thing. And the idea of intentionality in mating, mate selection, all these things, I think to a certain extent, the disappearance of that aristocratic class has made grappling with an egalitarian philosophy, you know, because it's always being dragged outside the bounds of legal egalitarian frameworks. You know, it's the disappearance of these class distinctions that has defended us from the inroads of communism and from the East and all these kinds of things. They had to come up with races to divide us rather than classes because of our innovations in the West. But at the same time, it sort of has thrust this whole puzzle of how to deal with egalitarianism upon us simply because we dispensed with the idea that there was a class wherein that type of pursuit of the excellent would, at least in theory, take place. Obviously, you know, aristocracy was, sometimes you got great and sometimes you got awful, you know, and you had to just kind of suck it up either way. But let's come back to your 3 points.
Right. So I would say that just empirically, if you look at the ancient Greek and Roman civilizations, there was, as I noted, this spark of individualism, but it didn't extend to everyone. It didn't even extend to normal citizens, right? It was, as you say, a kind of privilege of the aristocracy, whereas in Christianity, you have this idea of the individual soul. But at the same time, that's only another piece of individualism. There are plenty of authoritarian, reactionary Christian societies, and especially if they're non-white societies, it does not transform them into individualist, classical, liberal societies. And then finally, I think that we just have to be honest about the fact that there do seem to be, I can't name say, an individualist, non-white society. I think it's just important that we're upfront about that. So it's not that I've necessarily perceived this deep metaphysical connection between them. I think it's just the reality that we have to contend with.
Right. So in this case, specifically with the whites, it's less about, claiming a special status for whites, and it's more about just saying, well, where else does this exist? And I'm not seeing evidence for it. So, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but, this ground has been tilled back and forth over extensively, and I've yet to see it. I've done work looking for things like matriarchies as well, and you find a couple of putative examples of matriarchy, one of them contemporary, I think in the ASEAN region, but very little in terms of anything that could be described as matriarchal. And, everybody likes to call the Jews matriarchal when in fact that's imprecise. They're matrilineal in the transmission of certain cultural aspects. But anyway, so we have these three elements. And just in the interest of keeping this moving along, since I so often derail it, let's go ahead and say, for purposes of conversation, I can handle all of those as assumptions going forward, that these cultural elements are necessary. With Christianity, I see universalism. With the pagan period, I see, pursuit of philosophy, the origins of this aristocratic class, kind of distinct from the Lord of the Four Quarters picture, where you have a Hammurabi with his code, up on top of his truncated pyramid, acting as the focus of, as a kind of head for the body of the common people, the great legislature who's the man god or priest king. You move out of that sort of Mesopotamian framework and you end up in the West with the development of an aristocracy, which comes with all sorts of problems, everybody fighting one amongst the other. The old thing with Machiavelli where he said it'd be so easy to take over. It seems so difficult to take over the Ottoman Empire because it has one leader, but once you take it, it's very easy to keep. Whereas in the West, because there's so many contending nobles, it's possible to create trouble and seize power much more easily, but then the issue becomes keeping it. So we move from that sort of Lord of the Four Quarters, priest king atop his pyramid, to some extension of agency into a class of heroes who are peers, and then, you obviously have the lower strata. I think you probably see that a little bit with Brahmins and Kshatriya in India. So there's our classical world element. There's our white side of things. And then with Christianity, you get the idea of justice, mercy, and you begin to have to grapple with the idea of universalism. And I think culturally, we haven't even begun to see the issues that we're going to face as we grapple with universalism. It's this idea of universalism and our recognition of its limits, I think is going to be a Gordian knot that we're going to be breaking our fingernails on for another century. But so this gives us sort of some assumptions about the West and the culture. And, if we can take that and extrapolate it, some ideas about its trajectory. So we have this notion you introduced, which is that there is a conservative reaction that might even be biological. And if it's not against individualism in some essential sense as a biological and evolutionary next step, we can certainly say that it's against, and consciously articulated as such, that it's against the atomization, the splintering of our culture, its fragmentation, its balkanization, all these fissures, this crazed surface into which it's easy to drive a wedge into the cracks and splinter it further. And so the right is appearing, if you will. And there's this whole movement to reject a lot of this. Where do you think it goes from here? I'd said at the outset that I like to keep these between 45 minutes and an hour, but we're at 45 minutes, so I'm going to run this one to the limits of my processor when it comes to rendering. Let's run this to an hour and 15 minutes if you have time for that.
Yes, absolutely. My answer to that is that it depends entirely on whether or not those who support some aspects of individualism are able to cooperate with those who embrace other aspects of it. And what I mean by this is that you have on the alt-right a number of people who may nominally reject individualism, but they are themselves individualists in practice. They're eccentrics, they are free thinkers, they're deviants. The only reason I think a lot of them are authoritarian is because they know it's contrarian and they've been told not to be. But then on the other hand, you have the libertarians who and the liberalists who advocate, you might say, a system that can sustain individualism, but they are themselves often very collectivist in terms of wanting to keep opinion very narrow, right? Of wanting to sort of rally around libertarian figureheads and to be very dogmatic about their individualism. So I think that it's, you might say, political individualism in libertarianism and spiritual individualism in the alt-right has become fractured. And I think that only if those two distinct elements can be brought together in some kind of Hegelian synthesis in the future will we have an actual stable force that is capable of contending with the juggernaut of cultural Marxism.
Yes. I've taken a look, I once as a young lad in high school, I fancied myself an anarchist, and I had Nestor Makhno as a hero and was looking at Bakunin and Kropotkin and all this kind of stuff. And I went back recently because I was like, oh, anarchism, right? No government, right? Anarchy. And, I looked at some of the people claiming to be anarchists and saw some speakers at one of their conferences. I think there was one down in Latin America here recently, and it was just appalling. It was shocking. There were just a squawking little gaggle of collectivists, attempting to police their normative standards of behavior. It was strange, whereas my initial exposure to stuff like that would be, if you met some biker in the 70s, it was just like, mind my own business, expect the same, stay the fuck away from me. It's my business. Stay out of my life. That's what I thought of as libertarian, for example, and other things, the anarchism. Many of these things appear to have been subverted. I think a lot of the alt-right or dissident right people do have a good point when they assert that so-called libertarians are essentially a category of people who've been subverted with a slight retuning of their own ideology to precisely the degree necessary to make them be unwilling to interfere in the great screwing over that's being taken, that's being undertaken, that's taking place. So yeah, I've seen that. I wonder whether or not there's much future with any of it. Certainly politically, libertarians, it's just another flavor for a Fox TV show, to say you've got a host who's a libertarian, you have a host who's a quote unquote conservative. The energy does seem to be with the right. But then we come to the issue of elements of the right that are individualistic or at least tolerant of it as an aspect of the culture. And then you've got elements of the right that are very much like, they're going full bore, straight ahead with National Socialism. There seems to be a bit of a fetish for that at present. The idea that degree of collectivization and the idea that there's a spirit, a biological spirit to the group, and that there is some whole greater than the sum of its parts, a collective that has been reified to the extent that you can assert that it's worth my sacrifice and annihilation in order to maintain and propel that collective forward. That alarms me, causes me a considerable amount of concern. It makes sense to me at the level of a family, being willing, for example, to sacrifice yourself for your children or to protect your mate or whatever it is. But as that moves outwards, outside the realm of everyday interaction and more, let's say, more immediate genetic investment, I become less sanguine about its prospects. But we've got this reified abstraction of the collective that's being pushed. And that, to me, seems to be the greatest threat to our innate individualism. But I noticed you mentioned a thing that I too had mentioned. I think it was in a thing with Millennial Woes. You mentioned it in one of your interviews. I can't remember with whom, but we both had reference to no white guilt, saying basically, well, if individualism, individuality, that whole thing is so central to Western culture, then why worry about it? It's going to reassert itself naturally. So what are your greatest fears as regards relative to individualism as regards the rise of the right? And what are your thoughts on this idea that individualism, if indeed it's native to our culture and perhaps even to our biospirit, that it will naturally reassert itself?
Well, I think that statement is nonsense. I think that just because something is a precondition for an ideology doesn't mean it's a guarantee. I mean, after all, we've seen the vast sweep of white Western history has not been one of individualism. So the original European architects of individualism were very, like Thomas Jefferson, for example, was very wary about the need about ever being comfortable or contented about the status of individual liberty. I think that it has to be guarded within a set of preconditions. In terms of my fears for the future, I would say that basically we have three options before us. One is that the left are successful in their project. I don't see that as being feasible in the long term because I think that their outlook on life is so intrinsically dysfunctional that it will ultimately give way to some kind of retaliation or reaction eventually. I think my greatest fear is that they will succeed in provoking a right-wing reaction to leftism, which would constitute a reemergence of what I've called the anthropological man, or you've called the man in his animal state. What I think our only hope is that basically those who support the preconditions for individualism come to embrace individualism as an end in itself, and those who embrace the end individualism as an end recognize that it is not a guaranteed thing and that there are certain ethnic, cultural, religious preconditions for it. I think that whether that's going to happen or not is something that can only be told in the course of time. I think we're looking at a number of pieces of the puzzle. Can we put the puzzle together in time is really the question.
Well, this it leads me to another consideration that I probably should have placed on the table earlier, because you described pursuing individuality as an end in itself. You mentioned that you have an individualist outlook, and I certainly do. But you also mentioned, interestingly, that individualism itself is something that is not occurring naturally. I made kind of a counter argument, or at least suggested there could be another way of looking at that. But at the outset, you said that you thought of it as being something that is not entirely natural. I'm not sure I'm characterizing it right. But given that that's the case, why would you be an individualist? Right? I think I sort of argued from my own position in asserting that it's possible that it is a next step and that we're on the edge with it. But if you saw it as something that had to be protected but that was not natural, why would you endorse it or pursue it? Why would you think anyone else would? Why would it be valuable?
Well, I would say that a couple of considerations need to be taken to, in order for the answer to that to make sense. I think that, first of all, humans are in the unique position, I believe, of having both a body and a soul, right? So we have this kind of rational, transcendent element of the human character, which may have different needs from the biological, or a different impetus from the biological, more grounded aspect of humanity. And so I believe that basically there's a negotiation taking place between our kind of bodily state and the sort of possibilities and reaches of our imaginations and existence as spiritual beings. And furthermore, since I'm a Christian, I believe that man exists in a fallen state. So I believe that what we may see is a kind of fallen anthropology where humans have been sort of animalized, but that there is a kind of possibility of gradually evolving towards, you might say, a more mentally actualized, realized state over time, provided that we acknowledge the limits of biology. I think that we can slowly develop a society which speaks more to the kind of needs of the of the mental, spiritual, sort of existential aspect of human existence.
Okay, so the Christian element, that helps to make sense, because there is an inbuilt body-soul dichotomy. I wouldn't go so far as to call it an opposition, but definitely there are elements that have to be held in balance. And I guess that's not even quite right, because you have a horse and a rider, right? The horse and rider are not supposed to be in balance. The rider is supposed to be atop the horse. What would be more ridiculous than a cavalier with a lipizzaner on his shoulders? So in that sense, there is a hierarchy of the soul, and these things that are eternal and divine, or participate at least within it to whatever contingent degree, would have to be defended against the merely material and the things of this world. All right. Well, then, what sort of strategy would you suggest? It seems that, over on your channel, you mentioned this as well, but I had noted it myself, that you have sort of a project of unification, trying to bring these various elements on the right together. And, there are a lot of things that make sense about that. The idea that if you can cooperate, even for limited, more specifically defined objectives, you have, more people to engage in that cooperation, higher chances of success, less fractious infighting. Against that background, and looking at it in that way of bringing everybody together in order to be more effective and less scattered, what sort of advice would you offer, or what sort of suggestions would you make in terms of maintaining this individualism that seems to be a unique fruit of a particular culture at a particular period in its history? How would we go about protecting and preserving it?
Well, I think that it's important to not, in our conflict with the left, to become as the left in the process. That's kind of the eternal archetype of the fallen hero, the person who becomes the thing that he's trying to destroy. And I would say that in this case, the thing that we're attempting to destroy is positive ideology. That is an ideology that has a kind of original vision that everyone has to follow. But at the same time, we must be militant, because we can't simply sit back and sort of enjoy the decline. So what I advocate is a negative ideology. That is an ideology which is based on that to which it is opposed, so that it can still, you might say, fill the part of human nature that wants a cause, that wants some kind of collective action, but can, you might say, program it with a negative agenda, an agenda which is less likely to turn around and be the source of the new tyranny. I would also say that it's important to conceptualize ourselves as being evolutionary radicals as opposed to revolutionary radicals. That is, not trying to push for a kind of you say utopian vision, which is ultimately going to be a dystopia, but to reactivate that kind of spirit of the English Enlightenment, whereby we gradually came to a sort of arrival at the truth by smaller steps, and were thereby able to establish something more durable and more permanent.
And what would you say as regards all the people who do not, at least at present, have within them any interest in moving towards perfecting their individual person to whatever extent that's possible? I realize, speaking with a Christian, trying to throw in a perfection for something as fallen as man, even from my perspective, it's kind of a stretch to imagine any kind of perfection to individual men or persons. But what do we do about the people who are not very interested in individual agency and self-actualization? What do we do about the fact that they are always the majority, that the many always outnumber the few? Taking as well, you can try to teach a pig to sing, but you're going to waste your time and annoy the pig. What do we do, or what should we all consider when thinking about preserving and promoting individuality, given that it's always the domain of the few?
Well, I have a three-pronged response for that, and I think it's rather simple. The first is we need to conceptualize of our advancement of individualism as a collective effort, right? We need to, I suppose, insofar as the public needs an ideology, we might as well make it the ideology of opposition to positive ideologies. So that is, it will still be vulgar, it will still be unpleasant, it will still have things we don't like, but at the very least, as long as the public needs an ideology, I'd rather it to be an anti-collectivist ideology. You might say an anti-collectivist collective. Secondly, I'd say, is humanity perfectible with respect to this? No. We've lived mostly in tyranny in the past, and we'll probably live mostly in tyranny in the future. What we fight for are those brief periods of repose where things seem like they're all right, and we also fight for our survival in times when those conditions do not exist. That is the plight of humanity, I'm afraid. And thirdly, I'd say to those people, if I had to try to convince someone who might seem a lost cause, I would say that existence itself, not just life, but existence, is precious. And I think that nothing has been more motivational for me than when I've reflected on the fact that I have from time to time wasted that gift. And I think that there's no greater sin than wasting the gift of existence. And I think there's no greater virtue than making the best possible use of that gift of ontological existence itself.
I wanted to ask another question, but it seems to be such a neat wrap. It would almost be like, opening up another box right after you struck a nice rhetorical tone. So perhaps we can wrap it there, but before we do so, and in addition to thanking you very much for taking the time to talk with me, I hope we can do it again. I wanted to give you an opportunity to let people know the name of your channel. It's Right Ruminations. And again, just recap what it's about. Some people may have, skipped ahead in different sections of this video and hadn't seen it. One of the things that I like to do is help people with smaller channels to get more exposure. I was lucky enough to have some people do that with me by showing up on my channel, having me as a guest. So it's kind of like, passing it along. So please do tell folks about your channel again. Let them know where they can find it, as well as if there are any other if you're on Twitter or whatever it is.
Well, the channel is on YouTube, as you say. It's called Right Ruminations. I talk about Jungian typology, political theory, where I outline systematically my own political theories, the history of philosophy, nonfiction book reviews, and for anyone who's interested, also reviews of the old Star Wars expanded universe, which is a kind of hobby of mine. And in particular, when you visit, do check out the open letter to the dissident right and classical liberals. I have a video of that, and there is an attachment to the article that's a sort of centerpiece of my channel. Anyhow, that's a kind of introduction to what I do. And thank you very much, Oliver.
It's my pleasure. And are there any other places where people can find you? Or is that the main one?
At the moment, unfortunately, no.
All right. Well, one place to find you is better than none at all. Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us. Thanks to Right Ruminations as well. And we'll be back to talk to you again soon.